ròyìn bàbá Nàdẹ́kò ẹ ti di bàbá president.
Awujale Sikiru Adetona is an accessory to the kidnapping and murder of my father, the Ogbeni-Oja Chief Timothy Adeola Odutola. Awujale Sikiru Adetona appears to be very close to President Bola Ahmed Tinubu.
To keep building up a body of public figures to protect them should they be faced with arrest. Over the years, the kidnappers have given out land and paid out more than ₦1 billion from the proceeds of the kidnapping and murder. Today, their bank accounts from which they pay out bribes and my father's bank accounts, which they captured with forged signatures, have not been frozen. Today, they are still paying out hundreds of millions of naira to evade arrest. A sizable chunk of my father's 5,000-acre mixed holding of timber concession, rubber plantation, and palm oil plantation is what the kidnappers gave to Awujale Sikiru Adetona as his own share in the proceeds of the kidnapping and murder. The rubber plantation within that mix supplied rubber to my father's tire factories.
These kidnappers knew Awujale Adetona only too well, so to him they held just the correct bait. This is how. In my childhood, Awujale Adetona's first child, Ade Adetona, would often say to us of my father, as his own father's comments at home, Ilere, Are, Ilere, Ogorun trailer, Awujale Adetona's first set of children used to spend their holidays with us in Ijebuland. Amusing fact, but it was general knowledge in the house that my father's landholdings were something which Awujale Adetona coveted. The partitioning by the kidnappers of those 5,000 acres, once known as Adeola Farm Estates Limited, was actually done at a meeting inside Awujale Sikiru Adetona's house. Meanwhile, Awujale Adetona is not related to my father and I. Now, the file of Adeola Farm Estates Limited has disappeared from the Corporate Affairs Commission. The title documents too of the company's land have disappeared from the lands registry. My father made me a director of Adeola Farm Estates Limited. The kidnappers wound up the company without my knowledge. In January 2024, we finally had a court order in hand and were to go to arrest the kidnappers. Then, a day before the arrests were to take place, a Deputy Inspector General of Police, Biodun Alabi, head of the Force Criminal Investigation Department, FCID, in Abuja, cancelled the arrest of the kidnappers. Also suddenly,
DIG Alabi cancelled the arrests, regardless of the fact that two different commissioners of police in charge of homicide at the same FCID had decided that the kidnappers should be arrested. Alabi cancelled the arrest of kidnappers whose ringleader, Professor Mrs. Ogbeni-Oja Odutola, had voluntarily confessed that they killed their victim, that they killed my father, Chief Timothy Adeola Odutola.
Awujale Sikiru Adetona is a partner in crime of these kidnappers. Meanwhile, Awujale Adetona is a man who is clearly adored by President Bola Tinubu. The president should not allow Awujale Adetona, DIG Biodun Alabi, and these kidnappers to make it seem as if President Bola Tinubu wants to protect the kidnappers from arrest. The brazen kidnapping and murder of my father, which we finally reported in 2023, ought to be of concern to all of us as we grow older. For it was easy for the kidnappers only because my father, at 93, had become rather frail after suffering a stroke. Illegitimate children and their own children, it was, mainly, who conspired with strangers to kidnap my father from his house to go and kill him. Illegitimate children foisted on my father through the virulent witchcraft hypnotism of their extremely diabolical mothers. The tragedy for my father in all that is that these were illegitimate children who knew their own fathers all along. And that was why they could spend 14 long years planning my father's murder on and off and feel nothing whatsoever for him. My father's number 5 child, a ghastly woman who now goes by the style of Professor Mrs. Ogbeni-Oja Odutola, led the pack of kidnappers. They had become bitter that they had to wait for so long before they could kill my father. In that state of bitterness, they eventually carried out an act of brutal crowd murder. These are the faces of horror. Professor Mrs. Oyinade Olurin, her husband, Professor Emmanuel Olurin, Ofe Olurin, Mrs. Bisi Bateye, Yinka Aroyeun, Ade Bateye, Bolaji Aroyeun, Mrs. Bimpe Oshinaike, Kunle Adeyemi, Dickiness Deshola Adeyemi, Bayo Adeyemi, Mrs. Dejoke Fadina, Tokunbo Odutola, Madam Dupe Odutola, Mrs. Yimika Adeboye, Mrs. Derin Onolaja, Mrs. Shade Shofola, Pastor Olu Odutola, Mrs. Olufumilayo Odutola, Professor Akin Mabogunje, Mrs. Biola Otoki, Mrs. Yewande Ogunde, retired George Titi Mabogunje, Omo Ogunmekon, and Chief Simeon Peter Abiodun Ajibade, SAN, also known as SPA Ajibade. These are either actual physical perpetrators, accomplices, or accessories. At his lying in state, the kidnappers covered my father's remains with a mosquito net. They wanted to hide the fact that they had broken his head. Inside the church for the funeral service, the murderers still kept the mosquito net over my father's body. They now folded it several layers deep at the center over his head to hide the injuries to his forehead. The skin on my father's forehead was torn. It was almost unrecognizable. The kidnappers then used armed robbers to invade my childhood home on May 11, 1996, to drive my mother of his 5 biological sons and 3 biological daughters, out of the house, and to generally keep his biological children away. Mrs. Bisi Bateye, a vicious killer, the mother of Mrs. Yinka Aroyeun, is not my father's child. She was the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Shosonya, who married at the Methodist Church, Makun, Shagamu. Her in-laws insist that Mrs. Shosonya killed poor Mr. Shosonya, hoping the pregnancy she was carrying was my father's. My uncle, Alhaji Jimo Odutola, always insisted that Tokunbo Odutola is not my father's biological son. He also insisted that Tokunbo Odutola's sister, Mrs. Bimpe Oshinaike, a serial murderer, is not my father's biological child. Actually, in the 1970s, as Miss Bimpe Odutola, Mrs. Oshinaike killed a man. He was her boyfriend and he wanted to break his relationship with her. Bimpe Odutola will not let go of him. Bitter that he rejected her, Bimpe Odutola had the man, Charles Okafo, kidnapped in broad daylight on Nidiaraba Road, Lagos, and tortured to death. Okafor's family eventually agreed to save Bimpe from the hangman and came to an agreement not to pursue the matter any further. This Bimpe Odutola, now Mrs. Oshinaike, is an unrepentant murderer. The kidnapper and murderer, Pastor Olu Odutola, is not my father's biological son. Olu is the son of his mother's previous husband and was born in his father's house in Ishonyi. Olu is a spitting image of his mother's first son to the same man. Olu was surreptitiously and diabolically forced into my father's life when Olu was 7 years old. Times without number, my father tried to force Olu out of his life. Olu's sister too, pharmacist Mrs. Folashade Shofola, is not my father's child. My uncle, Alhaji Jimoh Odutola, lamented for decades to me and to everybody that Mrs. Shofola is his own biological daughter. Mrs. Folashade Shofola's mother was a plague upon Ijebuland. She seduced both brothers and anything else besides. This signature Odutola pendant you see on the person of these three women were in fact stolen from my mother by the armed robbers they sent on May 11, 1996. These three women are the daughters of Mrs. Dupe Odutola.
My mother's 8 children now deeply regret that for far too long we deferred to my older biological brothers and sisters who said that the kidnapping and murder must not be reported because they insisted that it was a thing of terrible shame to let other people know that one's father was killed in that manner. Now, a quick word about my father.
He traded in and exported timber and cocoa, alluvial gold too, from what is now Osun State. He was the elected representative of Ijebu province in the Nigerian Legislative Assembly, and he represented Ijebu province in London at the African Conference of 1948. From his 60s, he made a living from manufacturing his own tire factories, rubber and palm oil plantation, and biscuit factory. He earned income also in joint venture manufacturing with foreign companies, with Bayer from Germany, Cable Metal, the French 33 breweries, and from other factories. Continental Can, which he established with his lifelong friend A.G. Leventis, makes the can used for beer for Coca-Cola. He was an external director of the Central Bank of Nigeria. He even founded the Manufacturers Association of Nigeria. In the first 11 years of the association, my father was the president of the Manufacturers Association of Nigeria. In my childhood, the British High Commissioner, German ambassador, other Western diplomats, and the top echelon at that time of industry in Nigeria came to have lunch with my father at the banquet hall inside my childhood home in Ijebuland every second day of January to usher in the new year. I recollect also that the then governor of the Bank of England, Lord Gordon Richardson, as well as the Archbishop of Canterbury, His Grace Dr. Ramsey, were lunch guests of my father in Ijebuland. The Archbishop because my father was the Ashiwaju of Ijebu Christians. I have sent a dossier reporting DIG Biodun Alabi's open collusion with these kidnappers and murderers to the Police Service Commission, to the Minister of Police Affairs, to the Director General of the DSS, to the National Security Advisor, and to the Vice President. A few months ago, I sent the same dossier to President Bola Ahmed Tinubu himself. I even made a prior report of Alabi's cancellation of the arrests to the chairman of Nigeria's ruling political party, APC, and met the chairman in his office. I did that because I am a member of the APC. I am therefore deeply reluctant to make a public complaint that might cast the president of the APC government in an unfavorable light. I am the first Christian who wrote enthusiastically and convincingly in support of the pairing of President Tinubu with Alhaji Shetima, both of them Muslims. I wrote that it is not really a Muslim ticket. The points I raised, simple as they are, were regularly used thereafter by the president during his campaign. Had the president known of these winning points prior to my raising them, there would have been no need for that debacle of a blunder dressed as a bishop, etc., in July 2022. Meanwhile, ignore all those lies in Awujale Sikiru Adetona's biography. My father, Chief Timothy Adeola Odutola, it was, as the regent of Ijebuland, who made the very personal decision to make Sikiru Adetona the Awujale of Ijebuland. Ultimately, only, my father told me, because Awujale Adetona had formal education and had been a student in his own school, Adeola Odutola College. And it could be a personal decision of my father's only because Chief Obafemi Awolowo of blessed memory, Premier of the Western region, cherished my father. Chief Awolowo left my father with absolute discretion in the matter. Now, to everyone's shock and horror, once he was crowned, Awujale Sikiru Adetona then regularly disrespected Chief Obafemi Awolowo. So cruel was Awujale Adetona's regular disrespect of Chief Obafemi Awolowo that Chief Awolowo found him despicable. That was why Chief B.C. Onabanjo, when he was the governor of Ogun State, was told to remove the ingrate Awujale Sikiru Adetona from office. Awujale Sikiru Adetona was actually an almost daily visitor in my childhood home. On the issue of that removal, my father again saved him. My father told Chief Obafemi Awolowo and Chief B.C. Onabanjo that he will consider it a personal affront if someone who he had personally installed as the Awujale is removed whilst he is alive. Meanwhile, Awujale Adetona too kept coming to the house to beg my father to save him from expulsion. I recollect that at that time he had one bad leg. He limped when he walked from his car.
Yet, Awujale Sikiru Adetona's role as an accessory after the fact in the kidnapping and murder of my father was not his first betrayal of my father. One day, in the late 1970s, my father was on his way to Lagos from Ijebuland, as he did every Wednesday at 5:30 a.m. He was ambushed.
His assailants were not interested in the car, an S-Class Mercedes-Benz. The assailants came for the occupant of the car, my father. My father said that Awujale Sikiru Adetona sent the assassins. That discovery made him very sad. Awujale Adetona may want to take a lie detector test to deny that fact and to deny so many other facts. That was why in my 10,000-word handwritten police statement, I chose not to elaborate on Awujale Sikiru Adetona's role as an accessory after the fact until the kidnappers are interrogated. I reckon, with good reason, that a man like Sikiru Adetona will think nothing of sending assassins after me. Yet, the true catalyst for his prominence in life is the fact that he attended my father's school, Adeola Odutola College. Now, Chief Bayo Kuku and many other old boys of the school always marveled that my father had an instinctive soft spot for all students of Adeola Odutola College.
I therefore ask you, in the name of the Almighty God, if you attended Adeola Odutola College, please, in honor of my father's memory, keep away from Awujale Sikiru Adetona until his partners in crime, until these people who kidnapped and killed the founder of Adeola Odutola College have been arrested, brought to Abuja for interrogation, tried, and sentenced.
The motives for the kidnapping and murder of my father? Money, naturally. Lands, properties. As a matter of fact, paternity fraud and sex too were motives for the kidnapping and murder of my father. The serial kidnapper and serial ritual killer, Mrs. Odutola, joined the conspiracy to kill my father, not just because of her insane greed. Madam Odutola had a peculiar problem: paternity fraud and sex. I'll come back to all that in a moment. Meanwhile, there is documentary proof that the kidnapping and murder of my father was actually carried out much earlier than Professor Mrs. Adeola and her accomplices had originally planned. The kidnappers carried out the kidnapping of my father on April 13 because my father was frantically trying to have them arrested for the robbery they carried out against him on April 10, and also for a prior outrageous kidnapping they did. 3 days before they kidnapped my father, these same kidnappers robbed my father of all the documents and bags of gold sovereigns in his safe. They stole the documents to everything he owned: land documents, share certificates, everything. They cut his Nitel telephone lines, entered the house, and then emptied his 6-feet tall safe. Popular mobile phones came to be only in the year 2000. They came back quickly 3 days later to kidnap and kill my father because a steward, Achipong, their accomplice, told them that my father was using the telephone to set the police on their trail. It is a document from all this criminal activity that the kidnappers have used to reward the Awujale Sikiru Adetona. Every single land or property offered to you by Adeola, Bisi Bateye, Bimpe Oshinaike, Shade Shofola, Odutola, Beshola Adeyemi, Tokumbo Odutola, and their children, including those 2 criminals called Bayo Adeyemi and Bajo Odutola, since my father was killed, is a proceed of robbery, kidnapping, and murder. Every land document, originally from my father, offered to you by my niece Jumoke Odutola, Mrs. Jumoke Odunobi, is land Jumoke too stole. When his Nitel lines were restored late in the evening, my father reported the robbery to my older brother, Mr. Sunday Odutola. Mr. Sunday Odutola detailed the robbery in a 19-page letter he wrote and circulated widely to everyone, including the robbers, to shame the robbers. The robbers have never denied and cannot deny the robbery or the kidnapping and murder. The prior kidnapping to which I referred must be the most outrageous ritualist kidnapping ever in Nigeria. The notorious ritual killers, yes, you heard me correctly, the notorious ritual killers whose arrest DIG Ijebuland cancelled, Mrs. Odutola, Mrs. Yimika Adeboye, and Mrs. Deni Onoraja, with the connivance of the other murderers, carried out that vile ritualist kidnapping. Just before they kidnapped my father, Pastor Odutola Mrs. Olufunmilayo Odutola, Madam Dupe Odutola, and her illegitimate children and others brought in hideous occultists to lay ambush against and to kidnap my older sister, Dr. Bisoye Odutola, and my older brother, Mr. Adeboye Odutola, a fellow of the Institute of Chartered Accountants. About 20 of these occultists and masquerades, dressed in the most outlandish regalia, suddenly ran outside the apartments of Madame Dupe and the others, and seized my brother and my sister. They pounced on them suddenly in broad daylight. They overpowered them and forced them onto the ground. They stood above them and hit them with all sorts of fetish, threw and poured hideous things on their heads, and said the vilest incantations upon them. Right inside my childhood home. Over the years, unknown to us, all the staff had become people who the kidnappers had smuggled into our life. Now, this Mrs. Dupe Odutola is the mother of 4 illegitimate children. Illegitimate children who she diabolically foisted on my father.
Ibi tí Dúpẹ́ ò bímọ sí, ó kó aláwo àti olórìṣà wá síbẹ̀. Ibi tí Dúpẹ́ ò bímọ sí, Dúpẹ́ àtàwọn ọmọ Dúpẹ́ sáré láti fi tipátipá já Sìkí gbà lára àwọn ọmọ onílé. Dúpẹ́ àtàwọn ọmọ Dúpẹ́ sáré láti fi tipátipá ya àwọn ọmọ Ọ̀gbẹ́ni-Ọjà ní wèrè lójúmọmọ.
My father was already drugged via his food and in a state of near stupefaction when the occult kidnapping was carried out. Méjì nínú àwọn ọmọ àlè náà rèé, kidnapper, àjẹ́ olóró, olè ìbùkún, Dúpẹ́ Odutola nìyá wọn. Káwọn dé ilé ìrọwọ́ mú ní Dúpẹ́ àti àwọn ọmọ àlè yìí ṣe kidnap àwọn ọmọ àgbàlagbà bíbí inú Ọ̀gbẹ́ni-Ọjà Odutola láti fi tipátipá já Sìkí gbà lára wọn. Káwọn dé ilé ìgbókè ní Dúpẹ́ àtàwọn ọmọ àlè yìí ṣe di ritual killer jọjọ. Olórí burúkú ritual killer, ó lè jàgùdà ní gbogbo wọn. Owó olówó ni wọ́n ná, ayé aláyé ni wọ́n jẹ. Ògo ológo ni Dúpẹ́ àtàwọn ọmọ Dúpẹ́ ń fagbára òkùnkùn jágbà kiri. Just before he was kidnapped and killed, my father actually called Mr. Ariori, the DPO of the police station at Ijebuland Road in Ijebuland, to come and arrest Mrs. Dupe Odutola. That is a fact Madam Dupe will not be able to deny. These are the armed robbers, kidnappers, and ritual killers whose arrest DIG Biodun Alabi suddenly cancelled. These are the armed robbers, kidnappers, and ritual killers who are the partners in crime of Awujale Sikiru Adetona. I hope that Biodun Alabi's wife, his children, and the good people of Ilawa Ekiti, where he comes from, watch this documentary. As a matter of fact, there was never any ceremony of marriage between my father and this woman. This is what happened. Whilst my father held a public position as the regent of Ijebuland, scores of people and their extended relations jostled to see him every day. In the midst of all that, Dupe Odutola and her mother riotously insisted that she had become pregnant for my father. blackmailing my father, this Dupe Oduole, together with her mother, then moved both of them into my childhood home. They started bearing fetish all over the place at night, taking their bath in the open, naked under the cover of darkness, and then refused to leave. They simply refused to leave. The walled grounds of Onibudo House, where I grew up, is the size of 3 football fields. Enough space for everyone. Shortly afterwards, the Dupe Oduole and her mother then claimed that she had lost the pregnancy. 5 years later, now diabolically entrenched in my father's life, Mrs. Dupe Odutola bore a child. Unknown to my father, the child, now Mrs. Yimika Adeboye, was for our family doctor, Dr. Ezekiel Adeola, who was supposedly in charge of her regular sessions of antenatal care. Dr. Adeola, too, a decent man, was diabolically ensnared. Dr. Adeola retired as the Chief Medical Director of Adeoyo Hospital, Ibadan. Now, under the intense diabolical hypnotism, which Yorubas call Ishiju, my father was never quite able to see that Madame Dupe's children, Mrs. Yimika Adeboye, Dr. Adenika's biological daughter, Mrs. Bolanle Akintoye Akerele Adebiyi Shogosoya's biological daughter, and the other 2 are not his children. Chief Odutola conceived at those trysts inside Ikoyi Hotel is the biological son of Godfrey Ahime Uniboje. The problem was the occult sex which Madame Dupe and her daughters used to get any advantage out of strangers had become an albatross on her neck. It is common knowledge in Ijebuland that the Afars and Babalawos who arranged the Ishiju for her insisted that intercourse with Madame Dupe was imperative for reinforcing the efficacy of the Ishiju. Just as it is common knowledge, and anyone my age or older than me in Ijebuland can lay out the names of the different fathers of her children to you. Under the pretext of reinforcing the Ishiju, these men reportedly ravished Madame Dupe at their pleasure. It was for Madame Dupe a terrible situation. Mrs. Dupe Odutola had become tired of the 30 or more years of being casually ravished, literally raped by so many of these men. So, Madame Dupe was only too delighted when Mr. Shosoya's biological daughter, the illegitimate Mrs. Bisi Bate, her uterine sister, Professor Mrs. Onyade Odutola Olori, and the illegitimate Mrs. Folashade Shofola brought her on board as one who they knew would naturally want my father dead. In their 14-year on and off conspiracy to kill my father. Actually, Awujale Sikiru Adetona too was Madame Dupe's sex partner. Mrs. Dupe Odutola and her permanent living mother, Alaja Oduole, blighted my father's life for 35 years. Ignatius Ogbakani, his confidential secretary of 24 years, started the kidnappers off on their path to murder. Ignatius Ogbakani accepted money from their ringleader, Professor Mrs. Onyade and kept leaking the details of my father's will to Mrs. Onyade. That started when my father suffered a stroke 14 years before my father was killed. The will transferred the bulk of his estate to his biological sons. Onyade then co-opted as many women as possible, and an adopted son also, Olu Odutola, son of his mother's previous husband, to wreak havoc in my father's life. The kidnappers decided to prepare a forged will, kill my father, and take over his estate. Onyade and Bisibateye recruited all the other criminals. Unfortunately, we thought that the will, which forensic reports have now established as a crude forgery, was authentic. From 1995, the kidnappers then went on a rampage of financial crimes against us in Nigeria and in London, using forged signatures to steal money, shares, properties, and assets. Crime and fraud, murder is why you see Mrs. Yinka Aroyeun, daughter of the illegitimate Mrs. Bisibateye, representing the Odutola family on the board of Nigerian Breweries PLC, etc., etc. Crime, fraud, and murder is why you see an Odutola Foundation without a single Odutola on its board. Just the kidnappers who killed my father and those they fooled into believing that they are related to my father by blood.
All regular channels to get these kidnappers arrested, and these bank accounts from which they pay out massive bribes, frozen, have now been exhausted. That is why I have brought DIG Ijebuland like this cancellation of the court-ordered arrest of these kidnappers directly to the attention of you, the good people of Nigeria. With me, no doubt, the good people of Nigeria plead, all of us, very humbly, that President Bola Ahmed Tinubu should please direct that these kidnappers be arrested immediately and brought to Abuja for the continuation of the police investigations. I thank you for watching this. I pray that the God of peace himself will give you peace always.
Thank you, sir.